December 7, 1941, a date that President Franklin Roosevelt said would live in infamy. Japanese aircraft swept over Pearl Harbor in the early morning hours, catching the American Pacific Fleet completely by surprise. In less than 2 hours, 2,403 Americans were dead, 188 aircraft destroyed, and 8 battleships damaged or sunk. The attack shocked the nation and brought America into World War II. But within hours of the attack, questions began to emerge. How could this have happened? How could the American military have been caught so completely unprepared? And as the years passed, some people began asking an even darker question. Did President Roosevelt and his military commanders know the attack was coming and allow it to happen to give America a reason to enter the war? This theory has persisted for more than 8 decades. It appears in books, documentaries, and internet discussions. It suggests that Roosevelt, desperate to bring America into the war against Nazi Germany, but constrained by overwhelming public opposition to entering another European conflict, deliberately withheld warnings about the Japanese attack from the commanders in Hawaii. The theory claims that Roosevelt needed a dramatic event to overcome American isolationism, and Pearl Harbor provided exactly that. Within days of the attack, America was at war, and the isolationist movement collapsed overnight. The truth about Pearl Harbor is more complex than either the simple narrative of total surprise or the conspiracy theory of deliberate betrayal. What actually happened involves intelligence failures, bureaucratic dysfunction, racist assumptions about Japanese capabilities, miscommunication, and a series of missed opportunities that, when viewed in hindsight, seem almost impossible to believe. To understand what really happened, we need to go back to the beginning and examine the evidence piece by piece. In 1941, tensions between the United States and Japan had been building for years. Japan had invaded China in 1937 and was engaged in a brutal war of conquest. The Japanese military committed atrocities across China, most notoriously the rape of Nanking, where Japanese soldiers murdered hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians. The United States condemned these actions, but initially did little beyond diplomatic protests. By 1940, Japan had joined the Axis alliance with Germany and Italy. Japan's ambitions extended beyond China. Japanese leaders spoke openly of creating a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, which was really just a euphemism for Japanese domination of Asia and the Pacific. Japan wanted access to the natural resources of Southeast Asia, particularly the oil, rubber, and tin of the Dutch East Indies and British Malaya. The United States responded with economic pressure. America cut off exports of scrap metal to Japan. Then, crucially, in July 1941, Roosevelt froze Japanese assets in the United States and imposed an oil embargo. This was a devastating blow to Japan. Japan imported 80% of its oil, and most of that came from the United States. Without American oil, Japan's military machine would grind to a halt within months. Japanese leaders faced a choice. They could back down, withdraw from China, and accept American demands, or they could strike south to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies by force. But there was a problem with the second option. If Japan moved south, it would have to deal with the United States Pacific Fleet, which was based at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The Pacific Fleet posed a threat to any Japanese move into Southeast Asia. Japanese military planners concluded that if they were going to war with the United States, They needed to neutralize the Pacific Fleet first. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, conceived a daring plan. Japan would launch a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor with aircraft carriers, catching the American fleet in port and destroying it before war was even declared. This would give Japan 6 months to a year to consolidate its conquests in Southeast Asia before America could rebuild its fleet and strike back. Yamamoto was personally opposed to war with the United States. He had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He knew America's industrial power. He reportedly said that he could run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that, he had no confidence in Japan's ability to win. Nevertheless, if Japan's leaders decided on war, Yamamoto would give them the best chance of success. Now here is where the conspiracy theory begins to take shape. American intelligence knew something was coming. They had broken Japanese diplomatic codes. They could read encrypted messages between Tokyo and Japanese embassies around the world. This intelligence came from a program called MAGIC. American cryptographers had cracked the Japanese diplomatic cipher, which the Americans called Purple, in 1940. This was a major intelligence achievement. Through MAGIC intercepts, American officials could read Japanese diplomatic communications almost as quickly as the Japanese diplomats themselves. They knew that negotiations between the United States and Japan were going nowhere. They knew that Japanese diplomats had been ordered to destroy their code machines and burn their documents, usually a sign that war was imminent. They knew that Japan had set a deadline, after which things would happen automatically. On November 27, 1941, the War Department sent a warning to military commanders across the Pacific, including Lieutenant General Walter, Short in Hawaii, and Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet. The message stated that negotiations with Japan had ceased and that Japan was expected to make an aggressive move within the next few days. The warning said that hostile action by Japan was possible at any moment and that commanders should take appropriate defensive measures. But here is the critical detail that conspiracy theorists focus on. The warning did not say that Pearl Harbor would be attacked. In fact, American military intelligence expected Japan to strike south toward the Philippines, Malaya, or the Dutch East Indies. The warning to Hawaii was somewhat vague. It told commanders to be alert, but did not provide specific intelligence about an attack on Hawaii itself. On December 6, 1941, American intelligence intercepted a long message from Tokyo to the Japanese embassy in Washington. It was in 14 parts, and American cryptographers decoded it as it came in. The message was Japan's response to the latest American proposals, and it was clearly a rejection. It broke off negotiations. The final part of the message instructed the Japanese ambassador to deliver the rejection to the American Secretary of State at exactly 1:00 p.m. Washington time on December 7. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall and others recognized the significance of the timing. 1 o'clock in Washington was early morning in Hawaii. If Japan was going to start a war, the timing suggested a surprise attack somewhere in the Pacific at dawn. Marshall tried to send a warning to Hawaii, but there were communication problems. The Army's radio to Hawaii was not working properly that morning. Marshall sent the message by commercial telegraph instead. It arrived in Honolulu at 7:33 a.m. local time, but it was not marked as urgent. A young Japanese-American messenger was on his bicycle delivering the telegram to military headquarters when the first bombs fell. This sequence of events, the broken codes, the intercepted messages, the warnings sent too late, forms the core of the conspiracy theory. How could American intelligence have all of this information and still be caught by surprise? How could Marshall's warning arrive after the attack had already begun? Conspiracy theorists argue that this could not have been mere incompetence. They claim it must have been deliberate. They claim that Roosevelt wanted war and allowed the attack to happen. But this theory falls apart when you examine the actual evidence in detail. Let us go through what American intelligence actually knew and what they did not know. First, American intelligence had broken Japanese diplomatic codes, but they had not broken Japanese naval codes. This is crucial. Magic intercepts gave American officials access to communications between Tokyo and Japanese diplomats. But the Japanese Navy used different codes for its operational communications, and American cryptographers had not broken those codes. They could read what Japanese diplomats were saying, but they could not read what the Japanese Navy was planning. American intelligence knew that Japan was preparing for war. They knew negotiations were breaking down. They knew Japan had set some kind of deadline, but they did not know where Japan would strike. The magic intercepts did not mention Pearl Harbor. There was no smoking gun message that said, "We are going to attack Pearl Harbor on December 7." Second, American intelligence had lost track of the Japanese aircraft carriers. In November 1941, the Japanese carriers that would attack Pearl Harbor went silent. They stopped broadcasting, and American intelligence lost track of their location. Navy intelligence in Washington thought the carriers were in Japanese home waters. They were wrong. The carriers had sailed east, maintaining strict radio silence, approaching Hawaii from the north. The Japanese took extraordinary security measures. They chose a route that avoided shipping lanes. They refueled at sea. They kept radio silence. They sent fake radio traffic from Japan to make American intelligence think the carriers were still in port. These measures worked. American intelligence did not know where the Japanese carriers were, and without that information, they could not predict the attack. Third, there was a fundamental failure of imagination. American military planners did not believe Japan could successfully attack Pearl Harbor. They thought it was too far, too risky, too difficult. They assumed that if Japan struck, it would be against targets closer to Japan, targets in Southeast Asia. This assumption shaped how they interpreted the intelligence they received. When they saw signs that Japan was preparing for war, they assumed it meant war in Southeast Asia, not an attack on Hawaii. This was partly racism. American military and political leaders underestimated the Japanese. They saw Japanese people as racially inferior, incapable of the technical sophistication required for a successful carrier attack across thousands of miles of ocean. They thought Japanese pilots were poor aviators, that Japanese aircraft were inferior copies of Western designs, that Japanese industry could not produce modern weapons in large quantities. All of these assumptions were wrong. Japanese pilots were highly trained and experienced from years of combat in China. Japanese aircraft like the Zero fighter were world-class. Japanese carriers were among the best in the world. But American racism blinded American planners to these realities. There was also overconfidence. Americans believed that Pearl Harbor was too well defended to be vulnerable to attack. The harbor had anti-torpedo nets, anti-aircraft guns, and fighter aircraft. American planners thought that any attacking force would suffer heavy losses and fail to inflict serious damage. They were wrong. The Japanese attack was brilliantly executed. Japanese pilots had trained for months specifically for this mission. They used specially modified torpedoes that could run in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. They achieved complete surprise, and their first wave of attack hit before American defenses could respond effectively. Now let us address the specific evidence that conspiracy theorists point to. They claim that Roosevelt knew about the attack in advance. Let us examine this claim carefully. Conspiracy theorists point to the fact that American aircraft carriers were not in Pearl Harbor on December 7. The carriers Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were all at sea. The Enterprise was returning from delivering aircraft to Wake Island. The Lexington was delivering aircraft to Midway. The Saratoga was on the West Coast undergoing maintenance. Conspiracy theorists say this proves Roosevelt knew about the attack and got the carriers out of harm's way while leaving the battleships to be destroyed. But this theory does not hold up. The movements of the carriers were routine. The Enterprise and Lexington were on missions that had been planned for weeks, reinforcing the defenses of Wake and Midway, which were expected to be Japanese targets. The Saratoga's maintenance had been scheduled long in advance. There is no evidence that these carriers were deliberately sent away from Pearl Harbor because of foreknowledge of the attack. Moreover, if Roosevelt wanted to save the carriers, why not save the battleships too? Why leave 2,403 Americans to die? The conspiracy theory requires us to believe that Roosevelt was willing to sacrifice thousands of lives and multiple battleships just to create a reason for war. This is a monstrous accusation, and it requires extraordinary evidence. The actual evidence does not support it. Conspiracy theorists also point to warnings that were allegedly ignored. There were reports of suspicious activity around Pearl Harbor in the days before the attack. There were reports of Japanese submarines. There was a radar contact early on the morning of December 7 that detected the incoming Japanese aircraft, but the officer who received the report assumed it was a flight of American B-17 bombers that were expected to arrive that morning. These were real failures, but they were failures of judgment and communication, not evidence of conspiracy. The radar operators were inexperienced. The technology was new. The officer who dismissed the radar contact made a mistake, but it was an honest mistake. There is no evidence that anyone deliberately ignored warnings because they wanted the attack to succeed. Let us look at what Roosevelt actually knew on December 6 and the morning of December 7. Roosevelt had read the intercepted Japanese message breaking off negotiations. He knew war was coming, but he did not know when or where. The message did not mention Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt reportedly said, "This means war," when he read the intercepts, but he was almost certainly thinking of war in the Philippines or Southeast Asia, not an attack on Hawaii. On the evening of December 6, Roosevelt tried to send a personal message to the Japanese emperor appealing for peace. This does not sound like the action of a man who knew an attack was coming the next morning and wanted it to happen. If Roosevelt wanted war and knew the attack was coming, why would he try to prevent it with a last-minute peace appeal? The evidence suggests that Roosevelt, like his military commanders, was surprised by the attack on Pearl Harbor. He expected war with Japan, but he expected it to start in Southeast Asia. When news of the Pearl Harbor attack reached Washington, Roosevelt and his advisors were shocked. Secretary of War Henry Stimson wrote in his diary that the news was stunning. Navy Secretary Frank Knox immediately rushed to the White House. This was not the reaction of men who had expected and planned for the attack. But here is where the conspiracy theory gets more subtle. Some versions of the theory acknowledge that Roosevelt may not have known specifically about Pearl Harbor, but argue that he deliberately provoked Japan into attacking somewhere, that he wanted an incident that would allow him to bring America into the war. This version of the theory is harder to dismiss completely because it is closer to historical reality. Roosevelt did want America to enter the war against Nazi Germany. He believed that Nazi Germany posed a threat to American interests and values. He had been providing aid to Britain through Lend-Lease. He had ordered the Navy to escort convoys in the Atlantic, which had led to incidents with German submarines. He had moved the Pacific Fleet from California to Pearl Harbor as a show of force meant to deter Japan. All of these actions were designed to support the Allies and pressure the Axis, even while America remained officially neutral. Roosevelt also faced enormous domestic political constraints. The American public was strongly isolationist. Polls in 1940 and early 1941 showed that about 80% of Americans opposed entering the war. The isolationist movement was powerful and well organized. The America First Committee, led by figures like Charles Lindbergh, argued that America should stay out of European conflicts. Roosevelt could not simply declare war. He needed either Congress to declare war, which would require public support, or he needed America to be attacked. The oil embargo against Japan was a provocative act. Roosevelt and his advisors knew it might lead to war. They discussed this risk. They knew that cutting off Japan's oil supply would force Japan either to back down or to strike south to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. They knew that a Japanese move south would likely involve conflict with American interests. Some historians argue that Roosevelt deliberately chose policies that would push Japan toward war because he wanted an incident that would allow America to enter World War II. But there is a difference between pursuing policies that increase the risk of war and deliberately allowing a surprise attack that kills thousands of Americans. Roosevelt may have believed that America would eventually have to fight Japan and Germany. He may have pursued policies that made war more likely, but that does not mean he knew about the Pearl Harbor attack in advance and let it happen. Let us consider the practical problems with the conspiracy theory. For Roosevelt to have deliberately allowed the Pearl Harbor attack, he would have needed to keep this decision secret from almost everyone. The commanders in Hawaii, Admiral Kimmel and General Short, were not told. They were blindsided by the attack, and their careers were destroyed. They spent the rest of their lives arguing that they had been scapegoated for failures at higher levels of command. If they had been told about the attack and ordered to let it happen, surely they would have said so in the decades after the war. Roosevelt would also have needed to keep the secret from his cabinet, from military leaders, from intelligence officials. The number of people who would have needed to be in on the conspiracy grows and grows. And yet, in more than 80 years since Pearl Harbor, no credible witness has come forward with evidence that Roosevelt knew about the attack in advance. No documents have emerged from archives proving a conspiracy. No deathbed confessions have revealed the truth. Conspiracy theorists argue that the absence of evidence proves the conspiracy was well hidden. But this is circular reasoning. The absence of evidence can also mean there was no conspiracy. The historical profession operates on evidence. Historians can debate interpretations, but they need evidence to support their claims. The conspiracy theory about Pearl Harbor has been investigated repeatedly by historians, and they have consistently concluded that the evidence does not support it. Multiple investigations have examined Pearl Harbor. The Roberts Commission investigated immediately after the attack. A Navy Court of Inquiry investigated. An Army Board investigated. Congress held hearings in 1945 and 1946 that produced 40 volumes of testimony and documents. These investigations found that Pearl Harbor was the result of failures of intelligence, communication, and judgment, not a deliberate conspiracy. Kimmel and Short were found to have failed in their responsibilities to defend Hawaii, but there was no evidence that they had been deliberately kept in the dark about an attack they could have prevented. In the decades since, historians have continued to examine Pearl Harbor. They have had access to documents that were classified during the war and in the immediate post-war years. They have read magic intercepts, war diaries, after-action reports, personal correspondence. The consensus among professional historians is clear. Pearl Harbor was a massive intelligence failure, but it was not a conspiracy. So what actually happened? Why was Pearl Harbor such a surprise if American intelligence had so much information? The answer lies in the nature of intelligence work. Having information and correctly interpreting that information are two different things. American intelligence had many pieces of the puzzle, but they did not put them together correctly. Intelligence failures are common in history. They happen because intelligence is inherently difficult. You are trying to figure out what an adversary is planning when that adversary is trying to hide their plans from you. You receive huge amounts of information, much of it contradictory or irrelevant. You have to sort through it all and figure out what is important. You have to distinguish between signal and noise. And you have to do this under time pressure, with incomplete information, and with the knowledge that getting it wrong could have catastrophic consequences. At Pearl Harbor, American intelligence received information suggesting that war with Japan was imminent, but they did not have information about where or when Japan would strike. They made assumptions based on their understanding of Japanese strategy, their assessment of Japanese capabilities, and their own sense of what was plausible. They assumed Japan would strike south. They assumed Pearl Harbor was too distant and too well defended to be a target. These assumptions were reasonable given what they knew, but they were wrong. American intelligence also suffered from organizational problems. Magic intercepts were tightly held. Only a small number of officials had access to them. This limited distribution was meant to protect the secrecy of American code breaking, but it also meant that intelligence was not widely shared. Officers in Hawaii did not have access to magic intercepts. They were making decisions based on incomplete information. Communication between Washington and Hawaii was slow and sometimes unclear. The warnings sent to Hawaii in late November were vague. They told commanders to expect hostile action, but did not provide specific intelligence. This vagueness reflected uncertainty in Washington about Japanese intentions, but it also meant that commanders in Hawaii did not fully understand the urgency of the situation. There was also bureaucratic dysfunction. The Army and Navy did not coordinate effectively. They had different intelligence assessments. They had different priorities. Army intelligence was focused on threats to airfields and Army installations. Navy intelligence was focused on threats to the fleet. Nobody was looking at the big picture and asking, what if Japan attacks Pearl Harbor with carrier aircraft? This question should have been asked, but it was not. General Short in Hawaii interpreted the warnings from Washington as primarily concerned with sabotage. Hawaii had a large Japanese-American population, and Short worried about sabotage by Japanese agents or sympathizers. He ordered aircraft parked close together on airfields where they could be more easily guarded. This made the aircraft perfect targets for Japanese attack. If Short had been worried about an air attack, he would have dispersed the aircraft and put them on alert. But he was worried about sabotage, so he concentrated them. Admiral Kimmel was more concerned about submarine threats. He had been told that Japanese submarines had been spotted near Hawaii. He ordered some defensive measures, but he did not put the fleet on full alert. The battleships remained in port on the weekend, as was routine. Crews were on shore leave. The Navy was not expecting an attack on Sunday morning. The radar contact that detected the incoming Japanese aircraft on the morning of December 7 was dismissed as a flight of American bombers. This was a tragic mistake, but it was based on incomplete information. The radar operators were inexperienced. The officer they reported to did not have the full intelligence picture. He made a judgment call that turned out to be wrong. All of these factors came together on the morning of December 7, 1941. Japanese aircraft arrived over Pearl Harbor at 7:55 a.m. local time. They found the Pacific Fleet at anchor, aircraft parked on airfields, and defenses unprepared. The first wave of Japanese attackers achieved total surprise. They sank or damaged multiple battleships, destroyed aircraft on the ground, and killed hundreds of sailors and soldiers before American forces could mount an effective response. The attack was a tactical triumph for Japan and a disaster for the United States, but it was also a strategic blunder by Japan. Admiral Yamamoto had been right to worry about America's industrial power. The attack united the American public overnight. Isolationism collapsed. America declared war on Japan on December 8. When Germany declared war on the United States on December 11, America was fully committed to the war against the Axis. The attack on Pearl Harbor gave Roosevelt what he needed, a united nation ready for war. But there is no credible evidence that he knew about the attack in advance and let it happen. The idea that Roosevelt would sacrifice thousands of American lives and multiple battleships to create a reason for war is not supported by the evidence. It requires us to believe that Roosevelt was a monster willing to commit mass murder for political purposes, and it requires us to believe that he kept this monstrous conspiracy secret for the rest of his life, and that everyone else involved in the conspiracy also kept the secret, and that no evidence of the conspiracy has ever emerged despite decades of historical investigation. The simpler explanation is that Pearl Harbor was an intelligence failure. American officials knew war with Japan was likely. They knew it was coming soon, but they did not know when or where. They made assumptions that turned out to be wrong. They failed to communicate effectively. They failed to coordinate between services. They failed to imagine what the Japanese were actually planning, and when the attack came, they were caught unprepared. This explanation is less dramatic than a conspiracy theory. It does not give us a clear villain to blame. It does not provide a simple story of betrayal, but it fits the evidence. It explains what happened in terms of human error, organizational dysfunction, and the inherent difficulties of intelligence work. It treats Roosevelt as a flawed human being trying to navigate an incredibly complex situation, not as a comic book villain willing to murder thousands of his own citizens. Intelligence failures happen. They happened before Pearl Harbor, and they have happened since. They happened before September 11, 2001, when terrorists attacked the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. They happened before the Iraq War, when American intelligence wrongly concluded that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. In each case, investigators found that intelligence agencies had information that, in hindsight, pointed to what was going to happen. In each case, that information was not correctly interpreted or acted upon. In each case, conspiracy theories emerged claiming that government officials knew what was coming and let it happen or even planned it themselves. And in each case, serious historical investigation has concluded that the conspiracy theories are not supported by evidence. We want simple explanations for complex events. We want to believe that someone was in control, even if that control was malevolent. The idea that Pearl Harbor happened because of mistakes and failures of imagination is unsatisfying. It means that thousands of people died not because of a grand conspiracy, but because of ordinary human error. It means that history is shaped not just by the decisions of leaders, but by chance, by miscommunication, by failures to connect the dots. But this is how history actually works. Events are shaped by countless small decisions and accidents. Intelligence failures happen not because of conspiracies, but because intelligence is difficult. Wars start not because leaders perfectly control events, but because situations spiral out of control. The conspiracy theory about Pearl Harbor persists partly because of mistrust of government. After Watergate, after Vietnam, after the revelations of CIA operations and FBI surveillance, Americans had reason to question official government narratives. The conspiracy theory thrives in an environment of mistrust. If the government lied about other things, maybe they lied about Pearl Harbor. But mistrust of government is not the same as evidence. The fact that governments sometimes lie does not mean that every government statement is a lie. The fact that conspiracies sometimes exist does not mean that every event is the result of a conspiracy. We need to distinguish between healthy skepticism and unfounded conspiracy thinking. The Pearl Harbor conspiracy theory also persists because people find it on the internet, in books written by conspiracy theorists, in documentaries produced by people with an agenda. These sources present the conspiracy theory as if it were established fact. They cherry-pick evidence that seems to support their theory while ignoring evidence that contradicts it. They quote intelligence intercepts out of context. They make ominous implications about coincidences. They ask leading questions designed to make the conspiracy seem plausible. But when you examine the actual evidence carefully, when you read the magic intercepts in full, when you look at the communications between Washington and Hawaii, when you read the testimony from investigations, when you study the historical context, the conspiracy theory falls apart. The evidence shows that Roosevelt and his military commanders expected war with Japan, but did not know that Pearl Harbor would be attacked. They made mistakes. They failed to prepare adequately. But they did not deliberately allow the attack to happen. The men and women who died at Pearl Harbor deserve better than to have their deaths turned into a conspiracy theory. They died because of Japanese aggression, because of American unpreparedness, because of intelligence failures and human mistakes. Their deaths were not part of some grand conspiracy. They were victims of war. The legacy of Pearl Harbor shaped American military and intelligence policy for generations. After Pearl Harbor, the United States completely reorganized its intelligence services. The various intelligence organizations that had failed to coordinate before Pearl Harbor were eventually consolidated into the Central Intelligence Agency. The military services were unified under the Department of Defense. Communication and coordination were improved. The goal was to make sure that another Pearl Harbor could never happen. But intelligence failures continued. The lesson of Pearl Harbor is not that conspiracies explain disasters. The lesson is that intelligence is difficult, that even with good information, it is hard to predict exactly what will happen, that organizations need to communicate and coordinate, that leaders need to question their assumptions, that preparation and vigilance are essential. Understanding what really happened at Pearl Harbor matters. It matters because history matters. If we believe false conspiracy theories, we misunderstand the past. If we misunderstand the past, we cannot learn its lessons. If we cannot learn from history, we are condemned to repeat its mistakes. The truth about Pearl Harbor is that it was a devastating surprise attack that killed thousands of Americans and brought the United States into World War II. It happened not because Roosevelt let it happen, but because American military and intelligence services failed to anticipate Japanese strategy, failed to interpret intelligence correctly, and failed to prepare Hawaii's defenses adequately. These failures had many causes, including racism, overconfidence, poor communication, bureaucratic dysfunction, and the inherent difficulties of predicting enemy action. This truth is more complex than a simple conspiracy theory. It requires us to understand organizational behavior, intelligence analysis, diplomatic history, military strategy, and human psychology. It requires us to think about how mistakes happen, how assumptions can be wrong, how even intelligent and well-meaning people can fail to see what is coming. It does not give us a simple villain to blame. It shows us that history is complicated, that disasters can happen through a combination of many small failures rather than one big conspiracy. The conspiracy theory about Pearl Harbor will probably never go away completely. Conspiracy theories are resilient. They thrive on the internet. They appeal to people who are suspicious of government or who want simple explanations for complex events. But for those who care about historical truth, the evidence is clear. America did not know that Pearl Harbor was coming and let it happen. America was caught by surprise because of intelligence failures, not because of conspiracy.